Joining me now, Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy during the Obama administration. He is an MSNBC political analyst. And Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper is a partner at the Asia Group and a former special assistant to the president and senior director for East Asia at the National Security Council during the Biden administration. Great to have you both here. Thank you for being with us. Mira, let me ask you this. This is not, it's tempting to say, and we will say, because certainly things have deteriorated in the last 6 months or so, but this has been a longer term thing. China's influence on the world stage has been growing and America's has been declining. It seems to have accelerated in the last few months.
I think that's right, Ali. Exactly right. I think if you were to look back at public opinion polling from the first Trump administration, you would also have seen the gap close between the United States and China on the global stage. Many of the same countries who are being polled in this recent poll that you referenced are in Europe and in Asia, and they also had relatively unfavorable views of President Trump and began to think a little bit more highly of China. Of course, we saw public opinion in the United States rebound quickly after President Biden came into office. But we've seen that opinion crater again just this year since President Trump returned. But as you've referenced, Ali, what we're seeing here is at least a couple of different major factors play out. First, it is absolutely the case, as you referenced in your intro, that many of our allies abroad are bristling at some of President Trump's policies, whether that's pressure to spend more on defense, threats to invade Greenland, or threats to pull back weapons and intelligence support from Ukraine. They also absolutely have reacted very poorly to the April 2nd Liberation Day tariff announcements and are finding it very hard to negotiate with the Trump administration since. But as you say, part of this is also capturing a perception that's been going on for a long time. And that is the idea that the United States is simply not as powerful as it once was. And this is a sentiment that predates President Trump and will probably be with us long after he leaves office.
Rick, this is tricky because there are lots of reasons that countries would rather have tighter relations with the United States. But China not only looks a little more stable at the moment, but it does make these very, very big investments. It does build railways and ports and things people want. And most people wouldn't agree that it should be, those things should come with no terms and no conditions. But China provides fewer terms and conditions than the United States does.
Yes, and Ali, it's not just the public diplomacy of what China does. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is over $1 trillion that they've spent over the last 20 years. That's 10 times the size of the Marshall Plan. Wow. But China is the world's largest producer of steel, of aluminum. They produce 2/3 of the world's electric vehicles. They're the largest coal producer. They're the largest producer of alternative energy. These deals that they're making are not, philanthropic deals like the way the Marshall Plan is, but that is the way of the world. I mean, they used to say America was the leader of the free world, but the free world is receding. Every year for the last 19 years, according to Freedom House, there are fewer democratic countries and more countries veering towards authoritarianism. And, as Mira said, this predates President Trump, certainly, but he is absolutely an accelerant of it, and the person who's causing people to go like, maybe all of these values that America represented are now gone forever. I feel like we're a little like what political scientists talked about the UK after World War II, that it subsided from Great Britain to Little England. We're going from the United States of America to Little America under Donald Trump.
So, Mira, there's the transactional part of it, right? There is the fact that China will give you money for your ports and your railways. There is the actual fact that they produce more steel and aluminum and coal and EVs and all that kind of stuff. From a national security perspective, because this is what you did, how do we think about this? Because when you end up buying or indebted to a country that is in some cases an adversary, in some cases an ally, but in other cases an adversary, what's the danger of that over the longer term?
Well, there are significant dangers, Ali. You know, Richard laid out, I think, very clearly the reason why many countries around the world feel like they can and should partner with China, because there is just so much massive investment available. But for many of the countries who join up to the Belt and Road Initiative, they'll find that the projects that China builds in their countries are low standards. They might not get completed. They won't use local labor. They'll use their own labor. They may actually just up and leave the project without ever finishing it. And they may also find themselves bound to contracts in which they don't really understand the terms, taking on more and more debt that can ultimately have a big impact on their sovereignty. In the digital space, there have long been concerns that Chinese technology infrastructure will leave the Chinese government and Chinese companies with back doors into other countries' digital infrastructure that could itself pose significant security risk. And of course, just this week, we saw a decision, a really seismic decision by the Trump administration to allow the company NVIDIA to export H20 chips to China, which may potentially allow the Chinese to get their hands around this critical type of technology. So there are all kinds of risks to working with China in critical infrastructure and on a wide variety of projects. But the real problem here is, Ali, that if the United States wants other allies and partners to choose different options, not non-Chinese options,
right,
we have to put up those options ourselves.
You have to put up, exactly.
Exactly. And we have to work with allies to come up with a better deal than what China can provide.
Okay.
Now, if at the same time we're reducing foreign aid or we're reducing our allies' desire to work with us on critical tech projects abroad, we don't have a counteroffer.
Continuing a really interesting conversation about the declining influence of the United States on the world stage and how China is making up for that and benefiting from it. Back with me, former Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in the Obama administration, Rick Stengel, and Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper, former Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania at the White House National Security Council. Rick, Mira just gave us a list of reasons why countries that decide to do more with China could end up in some trouble for doing it. All through Africa, these infrastructure projects, they thought it would lead to lots of employment. It turns out China just exported workers to do many of these jobs. That said, the last thing Mira said is that if America wants to take this influence back, it's got to have a viable option on the table. And that's the problem right now, that we're not necessarily presenting people with a viable option other than we don't think you should do as much business with China.
Yes. I mean, while she was talking, I remembered when I was in the Obama administration and I was in Africa talking to a foreign minister, and we had a very good conversation. And at the end, he said, who do you think I'm going to listen to? You come and talk to me about transparency and LGBTQ rights, and they come and build me a superhighway. Yeah. That is a lot of the ways that foreign countries think about it. But the thing that also is a bit depressing to me, Ali, and I know this is a bit of a down discussion, is that even those areas that are huge strategic advantages for us are areas that Trump is clamping down on. Higher education. We have more universities in the top 100 universities in the world than the next 10 countries combined. Wow. We make $100 billion from foreign students coming to study here. We make $1 trillion from tourism, which is a lot of it is the families of those students coming here. And we're the fact that we're not opening our doors to foreign students, the fact that we're clamping down on diversity, equity, and inclusion at universities under the Trump administration, this is getting in the way of one of the biggest strategic advantages that we have. These are the things that make people revere America, that make people spend money here, that want to come here, and we're cutting back on them. That just seems to me really stupid.
And Mira, we're sort of excluding the hard power, the military power part of this conversation, which is super important because China is a growing military power. Let's just continue the conversation on the soft power. Putting aside the deterioration at the State Department under the Trump administration, you mentioned USAID. This was probably one of the most influential things America could do in the world vis-a-vis China, right? It was in Africa and in Asia, literally saving people and children's lives. And we're pulling back from something that wasn't particularly expensive for our purposes. In fact, wasn't expensive at all.
That's absolutely right, Ali. What we spend on foreign aid absolutely pales in comparison to what we spend on defense and in so many other areas where we are trying to compete with China. But as Rick said, if you talk to partners in Africa and Asia, what they tell you they want is not some major military program. What they want is roads. They want the United States to help them build hospitals. And a lot of how we have done this in the past is by working with our foreign aid toolkit through USAID and the State Department to figure out how to provide these partners with types of assistance that will allow us to put up a competitive show against the PRC, whether that's building the road or partnering with others to come up with a project that will also meet that country's needs. So by reducing that toolkit in a critical moment where the competition between US China has never been more fierce, it can feel tantamount to surrendering in many of these countries where there is no question that they need the investment for their own domestic economy and political survival.
Rick, is this the kind of thing that can be reversed later under an administration that sees this a little more clearly, or are we crossing a Rubicon here?
You know, Ali, I don't know. I hope that we're not. You know, when I was editor of Time, the one thing I was not going to do was to say that the American century was over. The American century, that phrase was coined by Henry Luce, the founder of Time. I still think when it comes to soft power, the most powerful thing about soft power is culture. And that's another strategic advantage for us. When I was at the State Department, someone asked me, who do I think the most powerful soft power person was at the State Department or anywhere? And I said, I couldn't tell whether it was Taylor Swift or Beyonce. You know, China doesn't have Beyonce. They don't have Taylor Swift. Those are things that part of American creativity, the fact that in a democratic society, we prize creativity and reward it, that is something that unique around the world. And that still is a great attractor for America.
Thanks so much for this discussion. It's an important one, and we'll have it many times, I think, unfortunately, in the next couple of years. Rick Stengel is a former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy during the Obama administration and an MSNBC political analyst. Mira Rapp-Hooper is a former Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania at the White House National Security Council and a partner at the Asia Group.